Hey everyone, it's Daniel Elwood and Robert Johnson, and we are the Last Nighters. And the Last Nighters can be found on the Launchpad Media, where they're always launching new ideas in your direction. This is episode 116 of the show. And shit, I know shit's bad right now with all the starving bullshit and dust storms. We are running out of French fries and burrito coverings, but I've got a solution. Now, I understand everyone's shit's emotional right now, but I've got a 3-point plan that's going to fix everything. Number one, we got a guy, Jon Reed. Number two, he's got a higher IQ than any man alive. And number three, he's going to fix everything. Jon Reed is a communications professional who's been a writer and video creator for the past 20 years. He enjoys debating current events and explaining the blessings of liberty and how to get it, along with long walks on the beach. Jon's a movie buff, wine lover, introvert, who enjoys time chilling at home or hanging out with a select few people who spike his intellect and curiosity. And cats. Yes, he's a cat person, and he's about to get married. Welcome back to the show, Jon. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here once again.
All right. Well, we are happy to have you here. This is an unprecedented time in our pre-show bonus content normally available for our Patreon supporters. We were talking about how we're all beaming in from different FEMA regions, and due to the pandemic, epidemic, crisis, panic, hysterics that are going on in the world today. And we just happened to have already selected this movie long ago, or you selected this movie long ago, and the timing is just about right.
Mm-hmm.
So,
unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, there's a lot going on for sure. And this movie gives us plenty to discuss, even, not specific to the movie, but just current day events and maybe how they relate. So anyway, without further ado, should we start like we normally do with the go-go description? All right, motion carries. And the band played on. It says 1993 here, but I think I saw it said 1992 elsewhere. It's an HBO film, 2 hours and 21 minutes, 7.8 IMDb, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, and 87% of Google users liked it. The description reads, in 1981, epidemiologist Don Francis, played by Matthew Modine, learns of an increased rate of death among gay men in urban areas. The startling information leads him to begin investigating the outbreak, which is ultimately identified as AIDS. His journey finds mostly opposition from politicians and doctors, but several join him in his cause. And as it becomes apparent that people have personal reasons to turn the other cheek, Francis persists. Meanwhile, the number of deaths continue to grow. This came out on September 11th, 1993. The director is Roger Spottiswoode, and I believe he also did some Bond movies, Casino Royale, perhaps. So this was an HBO film. It won a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Television Movie, and that is the description so far. I'll go to Robert for his take on that and his opening information.
I don't really have a whole lot of opening information, but I will give you my take on what you said, Daniel. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you for quoting my namesake film in your little intro there, Daniel. I don't know how many people caught that, but I appreciated that. Mr. Cruz, I believe. Is that right? Mr. Terry Crews?
That's right. Yes. President Camacho.
Indeed. Indeed. So I can see why Matthew Modine, I don't know why he was a thing ever, but I can see why he was a little bit of a thing for a little while. He always strikes me as like the terrible actor. He reminds me of Marty McFly's dad when he goes up to Biff and he's like, "Hey, man, get your damn hands off her," as he's trying to get Biff out of the car when he's like getting on to his woman.
Oh, yeah. He's got a Crispin Glover vibe. Yeah, for sure.
And not only that, but just like bad actor Crispin Glover vibe. So I have a problem with Matthew Modine. I'm glad he's not in more films. So when I do see him, it's like, man, really? Him again? But there's not a lot. So it's fine. This film, man, we saw Contagion recently, which was a terrible movie that failed at, making it a human story, this massive pandemic that's killing millions of people. This movie is a much more intimate affair. It focuses on a certain few people, and we get to follow them throughout their journey of discovery and, fighting and conflict and that sort of thing. So for me, this was a much superior film. It actually was a human film. You felt things for these characters as they were trying to achieve this great thing, which is, saving people's lives and curing this disease. So it's nice to watch these two films fairly close together. Because there's a real comparison between the two, and I don't know. I think this one's just far superior. It's not as beautifully shot. Obviously, it's dated in the looks department, but it's got a lot of famous people, their talents to the film. Apparently, it's taken from a very long, exhaustive kind of dictionary type book. And I think they came together and they formed a pretty solid narrative for the film. I mean, it follows, unfortunately, these CDC doctors, which are the, government bureaucrat types. So they're always dealing with this funding. And I'm sure we can get into that. That's, probably going to be a good chunk of my discussion points, is they're always looking for more money in order to justify their existence or to try to, combat this new disease. And they have to convince other people that it's a problem. And like in the 80s and the 70s, and the movie shows this massively. I mean, if it was today, I think it'd be vastly different, right? With all the social justice going on. And if anything's happening to the Rainbow Squad, then there's a huge, massive uproar on Twitter about it. And there's all kinds of people running and jumping at the bit to throw money at it or to help them in any way, or at least they pretend to, or at least they're vocal voices about it. Back then, it was much more of a in the closet situation where people didn't talk about it. And yeah, it's a different time. It really highlights the different times in which we live. So this is, if nothing else, this is a fun time capsule type movie to talk about.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on a lot of that. I also kind of saw this as a bit of a left-leaning hit piece against conservatism and Republicans.
Sure. They ripped on Reagan a bunch.
Yeah, and the the stupid rubes, the country folk who didn't know that men could have sex with another man. It was kind of dripping in that, which is a bit unfortunate. It kind of took me out of this because I could see the agenda being played out during that. But I agree with you. It is a more humanized depiction of an epidemic as opposed to Contagion. Though Contagion, the trailer for it, I mean, it looked like fascinating and thrilling and whatever. And then we watched it and it was kind of a bit of a dud, but it did yield a very good discussion. So I'm glad that we did that one. And I'm glad that we're doing this one as well. So John, let's go to you. Now you studied film. So why don't you respond to the Google description and then why you suggested this way back when, before all these events occurred. And I'm wondering if it's from like maybe how the film was shot or presented, because I kind of was looking for that just because you were the one who recommended it.
Yeah, well, I remember the first time I saw this was when it came on HBO, and it was in the early 90s. I was still in college back then, and I was just struck not only by the ensemble cast, which you just can't overlook. They've got huge names in this film, especially for that time. So it's compelling in that sense, but also, I was probably back then, I was just coming out of my Democrat phase. I'd been a Bill Clinton supporter back like in 92. So I was probably just coming out of that, but I was, more libertarian minded. I was very, well, the gay population is, just like you and me. They just want to live their lives, and they had this horrible disease befall them, and the government didn't respond. That's my mindset back then. So I was very compelled by the film, and also I thought it told a great story in the sense that, like Robert said, that it's a very dictionary-like book, but it tells a very human story, and it's a long timeline to condense into a 2.5-hour movie, and I thought it did it very well. I thought that the story was very compelling. I thought it really drew you into the characters, and it's always been one of my favorite films. And I think as far as like, one of the HBO films. And I think I hadn't really watched it until a few years ago when I don't know why it came to mind, but I just thought, I haven't seen it in a long time. Let me see. And it's still held up. I mean, I think it's always going to be a very compelling story, even if you watch it today. And to the point that, the bureaucracy, the CDC, the always looking for money, the sort of thing. I think we'll get into that a little more. But now that I've adopted more libertarian and ANCAP views, it's even more poignant, because the whole thing that they're talking about is that the reason that this epidemic became what it was because of lack of CDC funding, lack of government involvement, lack of government concern, especially during the Reagan years and the conservative Inc. kind of mentality. I think it's very poignant in the sense that it's not just a Republican thing, it's more of a government thing. And how are you going to rely on the government when you're faced with a real health crisis involving whatever population, whether it's gay or in these days, like the general population?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good take. And it sounds like you had a similar journey to us. Like we were sort of left-leaning Clinton-esque types way back when. But that was kind of back in the era where it seemed like the left side was, hey, civil liberties, stay out of the bedroom. Government doesn't have any business poking around in there or mandating anything. And it felt at the time that conservatives were the ones imposing their morality on everyone else.
Yep.
Now it seems like the script has flipped a little bit. And one of the key points that really stood out in the film to me was when they were talking about fighting the bureaucracy and the city council meeting that they went to, and they're like going to close the bathhouses or not. And the guy was saying, hey, we've carved out our own little enclave here where it's okay to be the way we are, the Castro. And I thought, yeah, hey, that's totally cool. Yeah, you should have the rights that anyone else has. But it seems today that now it's like you bake the cake or you're evil.
Right.
Now it's everywhere. It's not just the Castro. Now it's like imposed upon everyone else. It's like the morality of the conservatives back then was what was being imposed. And now it's the morality of the other side being imposed and sort of mandated that we all abide by and, like, I don't know, worship at the altar of. It's kind of you guys get what I'm saying? I'm probably ham-fisting this a little bit.
Yeah,
we do, Daniel.
Yeah.
We do.
All right. Well, good. I thought I could segue that into something, but I guess not.
No, you could. You could.
Can I just say one other thing?
No. It's over. Show's over.
Fine. Show's over. The host has been shut down. What do you guys say to the argument of viruses were here first, therefore they homesteaded this property, and we, the humans, are the ones encroaching on their space?
I wasn't expecting this to go there.
No, I didn't either. No, this is a new one. I didn't know till recently that viruses are by far the most abundant form of life on Earth. Apparently, in a drop of seawater, there's like millions of them. They're just all over the place. But just a tiny little percentage of them affect humans, which is, good news for everybody, I suppose.
Wow.
But
yeah,
so in that sense, yeah, we are the minority. And if they had voting rights, then yeah, we would never get anything. So
yeah. So much for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, John, maybe a little bit more on maybe the narrative of what is being told here, because I found, just in watching it the first time through the over the 2 nights, because it takes us 2 nights to watch anything, I got a little bit lost and a little bit confused into some of the events that were happening and what the significance of those things were, because I am no epidemiologist myself. And I know they tried to dumb it down a little bit. They actually had a very glaring moment where they're like, had some guy ask some lady, so what did they mean in layman's terms? And then she explains to them. But I found it a little bit confusing, the narrative. And perhaps had I read the book or this, encyclopedic type book, maybe I'd understand it a little bit better. But can you run through like what kind of the process was in this film?
Well, for instance, I mean, at the very beginning, you have Dr. Don Francis, played by Matthew Modine, who was one of the doctors who was dealing with the Ebola crisis, and they set it up that way as kind of like a premonition of what was to come with AIDS. Now it's funny nowadays to look at what Dr. Francis did with the one patient in the hut who was dying of Ebola. He took off his mask, took off his gloves, and she basically bled all over him. The social distancing was really not relevant, I guess, back in the 1970s when you're dealing with Ebola. But I think one of the more early on in the film, I think one of the things that is set up really well, and I think that the kind of the point of the film kind of loses, going back to the blaming this on Reagan thing, when Bill Krause, played by Ian McKellen, he's a gay activist, and he's basically addressing the committee that determines the Democratic national platform, and he's basically just asking them to accept the gay agenda and accept gays as humans, and he gets a very cold reception. And I think it's funny because as the film goes on, we're seeing Reagan as like being insensitive to gays, and his administration and his policies are very cold to gays. But from the get-go, the gay community doesn't even seem to have much buy-in from the Democratic Party itself, except in San Francisco. So I think that sets it up very, very well as to the mindset at the time. And I grew up at that time, so I know pretty much what the attitude towards gays was in the early 80s, late 70s. And I think I'm not sure if they understand how much that one scene plays into their narrative of, well, this is all just a Reagan kind of thing. He hated gays, so he was never going to help with the AIDS problem. But I think that sets it up very well, and I think it's very accurate as to the attitude toward gays, even back then, by Democrats, by the official Democratic Party.
Now, just an offshoot of that, later on in the film, Gandalf is meeting with, I guess, a local congressman, a California congressman, and he's like, hey, if you can just align some of these policies, you'll have this voting bloc that can swing an election in an area like San Francisco. And that seemed to be the toehold in the politicians actually paying any credence to them.
But even he said, like, if he proposed any bill that had anything to do with gay people, it'd be shot down. So even he admitted that he was, facing an uphill battle with the attitude toward mainstream perception of gays.
Right. Yeah. And, I guess I'm a little bit younger, not a whole lot younger, but I tend to think of things like acceptance of lifestyles such as gay lifestyles or whatever were sort of introduced in primetime television.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it became more accepted, more normalized, if you will, like Will and Grace and shows like that. And I always wondered if that was intentional, if that was like a kind of planned thing to introduce such ideas and get them to become more acceptable by, getting people while they're young or being entertained and making it something that they're familiar with. I'll take my tinfoil hat off now and go to Robert with your response to that.
No, if you can make people laugh and entertain them, and you can make someone likable, and you can make the audience connect with that person and like them, and then they just so happen to also be gay or have a particular point of view on a thing, then you're likely to be much more positive towards that point of view. And that's how movies have always, and TV and entertainment have always influenced things. It's not that my argument is so convincing. People aren't really convinced by arguments. They like people. Mm-hmm. And if you like me and then you're more likely to like what I'm saying. as
Right.
opposed to like listening to my arguments and going, oh, no, that's a really good argument. Now, there are certain libertarian autists and certain people in the world that have that computer brain that do respond well to arguments. I'm one of those people. I really like arguments. If I hear a great argument, I love it. This is fantastic. But most people are more about, do I like this guy? I mean, you can tell by, who gets elected president, or, who's famous or who's popular. It's these charming people with a lot of charisma that can work a room, that are naturally funny, that are witty, and just really have that personability that can connect with people. And anyway, going back to your original point about you wanted to say something and then spur a discussion, and you mentioned they got together and they were going to like vote city council style on shutting down the bathhouses. And it's very real to what's happening now with Inslee just basically, or a lot of governors around the country just shutting down companies, just saying public health risk, and you're no longer in business. It's now illegal for you guys to come in and do business. When shouldn't it be everybody's individual choice on whether or not they want to assume the risk to go in and patronize a business or not?
Yeah.
Now, what do you think about this bathhouse incident? So these bathhouses are basically hotbeds for this disease spreading around. Well, you could say the same thing, the exact same thing for my restaurant and COVID-19. Now, you may not have the evidence yet that COVID-19 spreading around in my restaurant, but you could make that argument and say, well, this is why I'm shutting it down, because it very well could be a hotbed for this disease. So in public health interests, I'm shutting you down.
Yeah. What do we think? What do we know? And what can we prove?
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I think the bathhouse instance, I think, also demonstrates, because you have, I think her name was Selma Dritz, played by Lily Tomlin, who goes in, and she's a gay rights activist, but she's also a part of the Department of Health. So she has the authority to go in there and inspect the bathhouses and recommend shutting it down or not shutting it down. But she's very aware of this health risk to the gay community, and the cause of which is very predominantly in these bathhouses. And she really has no authority. Again, we're going back to the vote of the community, whether they want the bathhouses open or not. So in my estimation, like, what good is the Department of Health if they understand this very, very deadly health risk to the gay community, but even they can't go in and shut down the one of the main causes of it in that community? So, I mean, we're all expecting the government to protect us, even in COVID-19 times. But even back then, when it was very clear, I mean, it seemed to be very clear, at least as far as the film portrays, that a lot of the gay men who were contracting this disease had been contracting it in a bathhouse. They couldn't do anything to stop it and prevent the spread of the disease from going further.
Yeah, they actually point out that they don't have the authority to do so. But how the times have changed. They apparently just assume the authority to do it on every non-essential business or life-sustaining business due to some criteria that they alone understand, as we discussed in the pre-show content, that all business is life-sustaining business for those who run the business and those whose lives are made better by the services and goods provided by that business. But so it's very interesting that back during this film, they didn't have the authority to shut it down, even though they had a high probability of suspecting that this was propagating this problem. And to bring it back again to that meeting where Phil Collins was the one of the bathhouse owners, they even said during that meeting that, everyone's going to get a chance to make it known how they feel. Everyone will get a chance to share their emotionalness about the situation, not their argument, not fact, not, logic. It's how do people feel about things? And unfortunately, that's how things get done. I mean, that's kind of what you were talking about, Robert, where, people who have certain appeal to them or likability or have strong emotions can tend to get things pushed through that aren't necessarily in the best interest of anyone.
Right. it's a government has a limited amount of resources, and the loudest voices, or the ones with the biggest pocketbooks, tend to get what they want. And this is a movie where the gay agenda, I don't even want to call it, whatever, the gay people in the area were having this thing happening to them. And so they raise their voices very, very loudly to try and get heard, to try and get a piece of this government pie pointed towards curing this disease or fighting this disease that was affecting them. But this is what you get in a socialist world, where you have to either be super, super loud about a thing and really make it inconvenient for other people so that it's, politically viable in order for it to get done, or you got to have a lot of money to gain a lot of influence.
But in that scene, though, I mean, we're talking about pure democracy in that sense. Like, all those in favor of closing the bathhouses say aye, all those opposed. So that was really a pure democracy. So even then, you saw how democracy couldn't even help these people who were facing this very serious health crisis. If you're talking about socialism, maybe you want to put a more authoritarian Department of Health kind of situation in which, I don't care what you say, we're going to close the bathhouses because we certainly don't want to spread this disease anymore. Or you're going to let the people who had currently felt oppressed by the conservative culture and felt more threatened by Reagan's brand of conservatism to live their lives and let their freak flags fly and just go on living the way they're living. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, then there are consequences to you making the choices that you oppose other people in, opposing on or imposing on you.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels to today, right? Like, we're being told to almost essentially shelter in place or only go out for essentials, work from home, maintain social distance, all of these things. And a lot of people are bristled by that. They're like, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me, right? The Rage Against the Machine mantra. And it makes some sense. But I don't know, it's kind of interesting because in this moment of democracy, it's almost as if an authoritarian, a more empowered overseer state would be protecting these people from themselves, and it almost makes the argument for a government. But I can't abide that, so I'm a little bit torn on this because these people didn't think it was a threat. They didn't understand that it was a real problem because the spread hadn't been significant enough to impact them enough to where it kind of sunk in. So
well, in the lifespan of the disease takes a long time to develop. In HIV, it could be years and years and years before you see the effects of it.
And what was the real precipitous of opposing the shutdown of the bathhouses to begin with? I mean, the one activist said, this is another Reagan plot to push us back into the closet. So what they were really concerned with was not so much the health of the gay community. It was more of, well, we're not going to let this bastard Reagan tell us how we're going to live our lives. We're going to do what we want to do, and screw, if we were a more decentralized society, if San Francisco was its own kind of little republic, would they be more concerned with the health of their population rather than being concerned with whatever president happened to be in office had to say or think about them? So
yeah, and it's almost like this COVID situation is almost like the thing to root out libertarians, those who bristle at government. Feel like, what? I'm not going to do that, and I want to say that most of the time, individuals know better than some overseer 1,000 miles away. And so, yeah, it is just kind of crazy. Now, one last thing about that meeting. I don't know why we spent half the show talking about just this particular meeting, but Phil Collins, forget his name, Papasano, he goes up to the Don Francis. I think this is one of maybe the later meetings, and he's like, "Hey, we're all in it for the same thing, money. I want the money when they're coming in, and you get the money when they're going out and they're all sick. You doctors make all the money." And that just seemed like a low shot or a a low.
That was definitely something that never happened. Definitely a conversation that never actually happened. But go ahead, Daniel.
But it's one of those left arguments where it's like, you know, medicine for profit is evil because it incentivizes doctors to keep you sick.
Right.
That kind of a thing. And that just kind of stood out to me. And that was just another piece of, I guess, the slant I was seeing in watching this film.
Sure.
Oh yeah, there was definitely a slant to it. I mean, I'm not trying to defend the film in the sense that it didn't have a leftist slant. It definitely did, but again, I think through its interpretation of the events that happened during that time, I think it's also exposing very much how government does not protect us, and whether you're pretending to be for the gay community or whatever community, like there's a bureaucracy that you have to get over, and the ultimate determining factor is whether how much a bureaucracy can make off of you, or how much they can make by regulating whatever it is that you're involved with. But I think it's in its leftist slant, it's also exposing a lot of the faults with what it would ultimately like to see. Like, if you gave the CDC more money, does that mean that AIDS would have gone away? I doubt it, because I mean, first of all, the fact that Reagan was a president, Congress appropriates funds. Congress votes on the budget. So they were in charge of determining how much money the CDC got. So it wasn't Reagan. Reagan didn't have like daily meetings of, well, how much are we going to screw the CDC so we can get those gays off the planet? It was very much a bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is beholden to the higher powers in government.
Right, but even if the bureaucracy had more money, they would just be squandering it for the most part. Right. It's almost like, yeah, sure, they're underfunded compared to what they want or the growth in the budget that they desire. Yeah. But if you didn't have government involved at all, then you wouldn't have this idea that the problem is already taken care of or being addressed.
Right.
And you would have competing firms trying to come up with solutions, market solutions that would be far faster, cheaper, better, faster, stronger, all this stuff. And we saw it with COVID stuff, where FDA regulations were preventing tests from being created fast enough. Mm-hmm. There's been like 2 or 3 different things that were related to people had to like overstep or go around certain guidelines. Or I think Trump came out and said that he was going to relax a lot of guidelines, especially when it comes to FDA trials, or even trucking requirements like minimum hours or maximum hours, so that supply chains can be replenished as quickly as possible, things like that. I mean, it's like a tacit admission that the regulatory state is what's strangling the economy and strangling innovation and strangling things from happening. And then we get into, if I can pivot a little bit here, we get into the dick measuring contest between the competing like discoverers who are trying to patent the vaccine or patent the virus. This is where IP kind of comes out and like is killing people because they're fighting over this.
Right. These are the guys who are supposed to be, their first priority is supposed to be helping the public and curing whatever disease might be the disease of the day. And yeah, like you said, they're more concerned about whose name goes on the paper that discovers the virus. And it's very sick. And I wanted to go back to really quick to the scene that Don Francis, when he gets his workspace at the CDC, just to go along with like the funding to the CDC, he's got this office that's full of junk, full of old equipment, full of equipment that is obviously woefully not enough to do what he needs to do to properly research and solve this problem with this virus. But, everybody's just like, oh, well, there you go. I mean, that's it. Again, going back to, well, is this a Reagan problem? Because I have to feel that under Carter, the conditions probably weren't that much better. It's not like there was a utopia under Carter and then Reagan came in and immediately they got junk equipment and they didn't have enough resources. So it's very, I think it's very shallow to kind of assume that, again, it goes back to, well, government's going to solve the problem. But you see right from that scene that even when Carter was in office, the legacy CDC that Reagan inherited wasn't equipped to handle the problem that the movie focused on.
Right. And even if they had more money,
Right.
it would just, be more squandered than it was, whatever money they did have. I
Right.
mean, they certainly did do some work. I mean, obviously they do some work, but it's the seen versus unseen. That, Robert, you were talking about this earlier. We can't know the counterfactual. We can't know what greater levels of innovation and technological advancement that would have solved a lot of these problems faster, cheaper, etc. Because they weren't permitted to happen. They were, they were made illegal.
Right. Or they are made so as impossible to come to the market. Like you're talking about how hamstrung the market is by government. One criticism of the market is that small diseases aren't profitable enough to bring to the market. So that people, there's only affects like 50 people in the world. And so who would ever make a cure, right? Because there's just not enough profitability in it. Well, it currently costs, according to like one recent study, I read this just today, it costs $985 million to bring a drug to the market. And that's just an upfront cost. That's before you just to get to the market. That's not counting any like legal liability that may come from the drug harming people. So if we had a more like libertarian world where, the market was just free to operate, where people could innovate and try out new drugs and, talk to your doctors, talk to people, and, there would be studies made and that sort of thing, of course, too. But, if you took a drug voluntarily and maybe it harmed you, well, that's the risk you took. You can't necessarily go, well, now I'm going to sue this guy who made this thing and invented this thing in the hopes that it would help me. And now it actually hurt me. Well, now I'm going to sue this guy for millions and millions of dollars.
Oh, well, hey, that brings me up to my next question, the tainted blood.
Whoa, tainted blood.
Whoa. Yeah. So you're a hemophiliac or you need blood transfusions and you get the blood transfusion to save your life. And lo and behold, it's now got the HIV in it. And now you're sick and you're going to die as a result. It seemed to me that they were saying in this film that the blood banks or the blood Inc., the big corporations, weren't willing to ensure that there was safety in the blood supply. And there was the emotional outburst by Modine. How many hemophiliacs need to die before you save them rather than kill them? And of course, I wanted to say, well, all of them. No, just kidding. But
right. And then there was the quote about the doctors acting like businessmen and how horrific that was.
Right. And so I'm just curious, like, there's this famous video. It's Milton Friedman educating someone on the Ford Pinto and had the gas tanks that blew up. And on YouTube, it says Milton Friedman schools a young Michael Moore. It's not actually Michael Moore, but that's how you can find it. I'll have it on the show notes page, of course. But he's basically saying, Ford could make an impenetrable gas tank in this massive car that could knock over buildings like a bulldozer, the killdozer.
They make tanks.
Yeah, but nobody wants to pay that amount, so they're willing to pay for this level of safety for this level of car for this amount of money. And if they want other cars that are, safer or whatever, they can spend more money and vice versa. So he was saying that there's a calculation, there's a risk that people are willing to take on for a certain amount of price difference, right? And so it's like I don't know if it's technically an actuarial that you would consider this, but there is a crossover point where people are willing to pay a certain amount for increased safety or accepting additional risk. And I just wondered if you guys saw that as sort of how it's presented in the film, that it's the big bad corporations who are, of course, in bed with government, in bed with the FDA in this case, not willing to do the necessary things because they're costly. So they're basically trading lives for dollars. And I think that they're missing the calculus on the other side of it.
Sure they are. Yeah, anytime there's any kind of consumer product that is seen as harmful, they demonize the producer of that item, regardless of all the voluntary exchanges and all the lives that were bettered by that product. Like you were saying with the Pinto, I'm sure there have been all kinds of recalls and other kinds of items. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I'm sure there have been all kinds of items that have been brought to the market that have harmed people, unintentionally. Like I can think of all the guns that are manufactured that for some reason now people think they can sue gun manufacturers for improper use of guns. It baffles my mind.
I think one of the things that stands out to me about that sequence of scenes that you're talking about is that you have the evil blood bank corporations defying CDC recommendations. And again, it goes back to kind of the cronyism because what incentive is there for them to test the blood for the AIDS virus when they're going to suffer no consequences, not from the CDC, and I guess not from whatever FDA or whatever bureaucracy oversees them. So what exactly is the incentive? And then you have the scene later on with the kind of like the high profile patient transfusion, surgical patient who got the transfusion, Swoosie Kurtz, who ends up having AIDS. So it took that level of scrutiny or that level of protest from a very high profile patient to get policy changed in that. So again, we're talking about government versus market forces. And apparently the market forces took over in this instance because you had a very dissatisfied customer and a very outraged customer who voiced their opinions eventually and got the blood banks to do what they needed to do.
Only once the information was disclosed to them, like it was withheld.
Yeah, right.
Probably willfully.
Right.
Yeah, so that's another strike against this monopolized solution to these problems. And back to the blood banks and the cronyism. I mean, that was the FDA's jurisdiction, and the FDA was at the table, and they were like even saying to CDC, well, if you can't prove it,
right,
then we can't do anything. So it was like CDC can only recommend or suggest, and then it was ultimately up to the FDA. So it goes back to the bureaucratic nature of the state and competing agencies and all of these things that really just hamper safety and innovation and competition. So
and again, if these neutral, benevolent referees who are just standing on the sidelines and watching the plays happen, if they're not going to protect you, if they're not going to blow the whistle and make the call, I mean, what good are they? So why, again, do we always expect, even nowadays, after all the history that all these bureaucracies have of not protecting the citizens, why are we suddenly expecting them to protect us against COVID or whatever new disease comes down the pike? They certainly didn't do it in this instance.
Do you guys remember in that scene where they're talking about whether or not somebody's going to start doing this blood test?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody at some point says, but if they do that, then we wouldn't be able to compete with them. Do you remember that?
Yeah, there's the Red Cross.
The Red Cross, right. Remember, how did that conversation go?
I think the Red Cross was basically saying that if it's required that we would do these blood tests, then it's not in our budget. Therefore, we couldn't afford it. We can't afford to compete with these corporations who have all this money.
Okay, it's not quite the point I was hoping to make. Okay, that's fine.
It is in the sense that all these blood banks that are favored by the FDA or whatever bureaucracy oversees them, if they're favored by the powers up high, what room is there for competition for another blood bank alternative to come in and say, hey, we've got the test that we can do. And if, an outside investor wants to come, and we'll make sure that all the blood that we're providing is not tainted, is really clean. It's really good blood. What incentive is there for, a young upstart company to come in and offer free and offer clean blood to the population?
Indeed. Now, this information, I guess, maybe was somewhat available to the end consumer, but probably not so much. I mean, this whole medical system is all messed up in any number of ways, but I can't imagine as an end hemophiliac user getting a blood transfusion, you're like, they know where their blood came from and who supplied it and whatnot. Maybe it says it on the bag, maybe it doesn't. But
the Swoosie Kurtz character didn't know. She found out from the CDC guy who was who was reading her file off to her and told her where her blood came from. She didn't know.
Right. So I think if it was a more open free market, of course, you'd have different competing agencies advertising to certain different extents. Hey, we have this new disease test and we're going to have clean blood, and then we can charge a premium, and people would prefer that. I mean, I think people would be way more likely to pay a premium for actually clean blood as opposed to possibly AIDS tainted blood.
And there'd be industry organizations like the Better Business Bureau, but for blood, giving a rating to the blood bank companies who'd say, okay, yeah, like we trust the testing capabilities of this particular company, and we know that any blood that goes through them, they've tested and they know that it's clean. So their reputation will be on the line if this free market kind of blood approval agency, industry agency, put their seal of approval on a batch of blood, and it wound up containing the AIDS virus. Their reputation would be suspect. So they would have every incentive in the world to make sure that anybody that they gave their seal of approval on had clean blood.
And the liability policy insurance holders, they would definitely have an incentive to ensure that the people that they're insuring are using the latest tests and technology.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, it seems like the model that was being used here, the end consumer, is so far removed from the information and the option to even know what the price is, or if there's an alternative that may cost more or less and have different levels of quality or safety.
Mm-hmm. You just get blood.
Yeah, you're just getting blood, and it's an expert doctor telling you need it, and they're the one sourcing it for you, and the insurance company is probably paying for it, or the government is, Medicare style. So it's another hazard of removing the consumer from the pricing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If people were more sensitive to what it costs to do something, they would then make a decision that on how valuable it is to them to do it or not.
Right.
And
then how more involved you are in a decision being made, I think you take more responsibility for that decision. I think people get really upset when they go to the doctor and all this stuff is happening outside of their control, and then they get hurt, and then they're like, okay, I got fucked over somehow, as opposed to, oh, I chose to buy that Pinto, and then it still had a problem or something. It's kind of on me.
Right.
All right. Well, we can move on, I think, from the blood thing. And I think we talked a little bit about the bureaucratic red tape, but there's one other thing related to that. And that was, who's the guy who was the head CDC person? I forget the guy's name.
Yeah. The guy's name, the character's name was Jim Curran. The actor's name is Saul Rubinek.
Right. Yeah. And so he was giving a press conference about, this new disease epidemic that's affecting people, but they don't want to say too much about it. They want to be factual and only talk about things that they can prove, and maybe a couple of things that they might suggest. But Don had a problem with this because it's like, you're lying to the people. You're not telling them the full information. And his line back to him was, well, we don't want to jeopardize our funding on the one hand.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, we don't want to start a panic in the public. We don't want to cause a mass hysteria. And again, how the times have changed.
It's not hysteria nowadays.
Yeah,
it's good money to be made in hysterias. Come on now.
But I can see how that would be a very tenuous position to be in. You have to be very careful with what you say when you're in that position of authority, and you have to balance that tightrope of the bureaucracy and appeasing the politicians and the strings of your funding. So that's another strike against monopolizing this via government. But the other side of it is the words you say affect people's perception of the situation. Yep. Similar to how when the Fed speaks about something,
even
things in the market.
Couldn't even say we suspect that this disease is sexually transmitted, and it's predominantly in the gay community, and it's in San Francisco. Like, he couldn't even say we suspect this. Like, he had to be very careful with his words. Again, to your point, he's got to be very politically salient about what he says. And again, why wouldn't he be? His whole incentive structure is based on him keeping his job, based on not causing a panic, not causing concern, and certainly not wasting a whole lot of money on something that isn't politically viable for him to spend money on.
Yeah, so basically we're just saying that the system as it is pretty terrible, and would be probably a lot better under some alternatives. And I'll put some links on our show notes page. I know Bob Murphy has some discussions on this related to how the free market might respond to medical situations like this, pandemics, epidemics, etc. And also he has a book. I forget the name of it, but I'll put a Amazon link so everyone can buy that, and we'll get a little affiliate commission, like 4%. So 18 cents in our pockets would be nice right about now. That is about the healthcare market and how screwed up it is by government intervention.
And I think the final scene, one of the final scenes, I should say, between Matthew Modine and Saul Rubinek is when Matthew Modine submits his final report about recommended plans for solving the AIDS crisis, and his boss basically tells him, like, if you submit this, you will get nothing. Like, if you let me edit it, you'll probably get about half the funding that you're asking for. If you submit it as is, you'll get nothing. So again, we're talking about incentives, and what is the incentive if not to mitigate this horrible epidemic that's going on in the gay community? Also transfusions, also heroin addicts or needle users. He's trying to make the point that if you spend this money now, you're going to save billions in healthcare later. But they're not worried about that. Their incentive structure is not built to respond for cost effectiveness. They're just talking about what is politically viable as far as nowadays you could probably get AIDS funding out the wazoo, but back then it wasn't going to happen. Not in the Reagan administration, but certainly not in the Democratic administration, which wasn't totally on board with the gay agenda.
Yeah, and as in the film, the disease had 100% mortality rate at the time, but now it seems as if it's maybe been abated quite a bit. I mean, Magic Johnson's been living with AIDS for 30 years.
Yeah.
31 years. And I mean, who would have thought Kobe would have gone first,
Yeah, really.
Yeah. And supposedly I saw recently that up to like 15,000 or maybe more get infected with AIDS every day. And
yeah, it's pretty much, that's why it's a non-issue anymore, because you never hear about anybody dying from AIDS anymore. It was Freddie Mercury, it was Rock Hudson. And now it's just, all right, well, you just have AIDS and you just live with it.
You just take these meds and you'll be all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, apparently currently the timeline for an AIDS patient today or an HIV patient today is about the same as if they didn't have HIV, which is pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive.
Well, that's good news. I'm glad that it's improved. I mean, anything that you're going to die from, certainly. I mean, yeah, we're all going to, life has 100% morbidity rate, right? We're all going to die eventually. It's just a matter of how and when. But you don't want to see people kicking off too soon. And government is one of the biggest killers of people in the 20th century. I think it was something like 10,000 people a day, 420 million, I want to say the number was. If you look at R.J. Rummel's information about democide, and then also include wars, because those, of course, only made capable by governments. Yeah, that's a lot of people. If you consider that an epidemic, maybe that would be the crisis that we would all be worried about.
Yeah,
but that's just business as usual, so nobody gets upset.
Hopefully, we can just find a cure for this new flu virus, and we'll all be all right. But this it really is very personal to me. This whole issue is because I lost my dad when he was 68 to bladder cancer, and he was diagnosed as terminal, and he died about 9 months later. And so we would go out together and discuss certain things. And one time I brought up to him the FDA being in the way of real medical innovation. And he was a pretty staunch Republican. And he even brought up to me that, well, if we didn't have the FDA, how would we know that the drugs that we're taking is safe? And at that point, I said to him, I said, well, Dad, at this point, would you care? I mean, you're terminal. So whatever you could take that could possibly help you, would you care? And he really didn't have anything to say to that. So it's very, especially for terminal cases like my dad was. I mean, I just think that the FDA is just getting in the way, and we saw that in the early stages of this COVID whole ordeal, where there was a lot of red tape where the tests couldn't get to where they needed to, and it took a long approval process. So what good is the FDA if people are dying and we're now locked in our houses and can't go anywhere? We can't go to our local sports bar or to Robert's restaurant, for God's sake.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the cure seems to be maybe more harmful than the disease itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like the virus isn't the problem. The problem is the panic. Like the panic is the virus.
Yep.
Is the real virus. Human beings are the virus.
Absolutely.
And as if there wasn't the FDA, there wouldn't be some competing private institution that fulfilled essentially the same function, or multiple competing agencies. That's always annoying when people say invoke government as if that's the only way to do a thing.
Yep.
Well, and think of the job they're doing. Robert Higgs, who does great work in his book Against Leviathan, I want to say, there's a whole chapter on the FDA and the number of deaths from approved drugs.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the tens of thousands a year. I mean,
how many drugs do they recall a year?
Right, exactly. So it's like,
or the people that died waiting for drugs to be approved.
Yeah, and those don't even get counted, I don't think. So it's back to the seen unseen stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But
would immunotherapy have helped my dad? I don't know, because even though it was around and then it was under development, it wasn't FDA approved. So how would I know?
Yeah. Well, we've probably reached roughly the end of our time tonight. So if you guys have any final notes, I think I got through almost all of mine. We can get into summaries and reviews, but I'll give you guys the floor for a moment first.
I think I went through everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only one thing I have noted down here is the diner scene when Matthew Modine and Saul Rubinek are kind of talking, having a serious conversation for the last time, and Matthew Modine is very indignant. Like, how can he be such a bureaucratic whore and everything? And so, what struck me is really unique about that is that here Matthew Modine, his character Don Francis, goes to work for the CDC, which is a government agency, and now he's like totally indignant of the fact that a bureaucracy acts like a bureaucracy, and it's the health is politicized in a politicized agency. So it's really telling that they don't even see the problem when it's staring them right in their face.
And then there's also a scene where those two are talking, and it might be the same one, where he's asking Matthew Modine, if you hate government so much, why are you chosen to work here your whole life or whatever? And he's like, because this is where the bugs are.
Yeah.
Which is not even true, right? I mean, I assume that the Louis Pasteur Institute and all kinds of other places, they probably take some public money and whatnots and funds, but for the most part, they're essentially private. I mean, you can work in a private way to work on diseases.
And it would be far better, especially if...
And now with GoFundMe, it's even easier.
Yeah.
And if you weren't demonized for making profits.
I want to say Rothbard has a book called Science and Government that talks about this and the contrast between how technological innovation happens in a free market versus in a government bureaucracy. So I'll put that on the show notes page as well. It's a really good one to check out. So with that, why don't we go to Robert for your final summary review score out of 10. You can go decimal point deep if you like, or 2, whatever you want. It's a lady's choice.
Well, even despite all the kind of left-leaning propagandistic type agenda that this movie had, I still enjoyed it quite a bit. It's compelling drama about, people racing against time to save people's lives. And it really brought home the human element. It introduced us to some strong characters, and we didn't want to see them die. When they did die, we felt for them because we actually got to see people react. I mean, when Gandalf was like, he was going to die, his former boyfriend, who was like, the evil scientist in Jurassic Park, he comes up and he's like breaking down. He hasn't invented the evil dinosaurs yet, but he's like hugging Gandalf and he's like, doesn't want him to die. And, that tugs. What's that?
BD Wong. That's
BD Wong, man. Yeah. He'll go on to,
Gandalf even starts speaking Elvish at the end there.
Yeah. That was a nice little callback to his Lord of the Rings days, which would happen in the future. But anyway.
I missed what John said.
It's pronounced Magneto.
Anyway, this is a good film. Yeah, I liked it. Quite a bit. I don't like Matthew Modine as the lead character. I think he could have been replaced by almost any solid actor at the time, like anybody really. I think it would have been better, but it is what it is. And it's a good, strong 7. It's not going to blow your doors off, but it'll entertain you for a couple hours. And I think it'll humanize the drama of the early AIDS days. And I highly encourage people to, there are many, many interesting documentaries on YouTube about the AIDS and what has been done since this movie. So if you go from here, I know SciShow puts out a bunch of stuff. A lot of interesting work has been done since then that they've actually cured 2 people.
Yeah, I saw that. I have an article related to the second person who was cured, and I was going to put that on our show notes page as well. So thank you for bringing that up because I was about to.
Anyway,
right.
Go ahead.
Well, let's go to John for your summary and review score out of 10.
Yeah, well, first of all, I take offense to the very indignant dissing of Private Joker, so I can't abide by that. But I again, like I said in the beginning, looking at this film for the first time when I was more kind of left of center in the day, and looking back on it now, I love it. I love the film for the same reasons, but from very completely different angles, whereas I thought it was a shame that the government let this horrible thing happen or spread the way it did back in the day when I first saw it. And I'm still pissed off at that, but for very different reasons, because I know that government could never do anything but allow this to spread. So it's really a film that, you kind of have to be in my position to have seen it when it first came out and see it again today, and have that change of mindset. Whereas you still see the problem that existed, but you see it's the source of the problem from a very different perspective. And I think that's why the movie, not only because of the spectacular ensemble cast, not only because it takes a very complex story and really effectively whittles it down into a 2.5-hour film, but I think it's very effective in what it sets out to do, whether you're left-leaning or you're an anarcho-capitalist libertarian. So I give it a 9 out of 10. I love it. I love the film.
Wow, that's high praise. And I was kind of hoping that you'd also give us a little bit of what was good about it from a filmmaking standpoint, because I know that has to play a role in because all the movies you've recommended, they're beautifully shot, well paced.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I mean, you can tell that the direction is really strong.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the film was shot okay. I don't think there was anything particularly spectacular about it. But again, I go back to the scripting of it, the editing of it, and taking what was a very complex thing. when you're editing a film, you have much more of the film that you have to take down to a more digestible format than probably the director originally intended. So I'm very impressed by the way it's edited. I'm very impressed by the way the dialogue is scripted. I thought, again, like going back to the storytelling aspect of it, I'm really impressed with that part of it. I'm usually like a huge fan of cinematography, and I usually pay attention to the photography of the film. But I think while it's fine, it's secondary. I think the story kind of carries the film in this particular instance.
All right. Well, thank you. I think it was a fine recommendation and timely, of course, because it ties right into the current situation, and we're all, locked in right now, talking about movies here. So my take is that the movie was really good. It was entertaining. It was action paced. I was intrigued to see what was going on, and I was even a little bit lost in some of it, but it was still something that I wanted to keep watching and learn more about. It does humanize it. It is a sharp contrast to Contagion, which we did a few weeks ago. So I think that this was definitely worth seeing. And the all-star cast in this, Richard Gere was in this, Alan Alda, Steve Martin, Lily Tomlin, Angelica Houston, and if Robert's favorite, Matthew Modine. So, I mean, just a ton of people in this thing, and it's, pretty well done. It almost feels like one of those, perhaps they had a We of the World kind of situation where they're like, everyone's kind of signing on to this movie as like their part in like publicizing this, this scourge of AIDS and HIV, something like that, because this came out right after, I think, Magic Johnson announced that he had HIV, right? So this came out in 92, 93. He revealed that in, I think, 91, I want to say, or 89. I forget. He was somewhere around there.
Yeah.
But I thought it was really well done, and I appreciate that you suggested it. And again, the timeliness was spot on and gave us plenty to talk about tonight. So I'm going to go with an 8 on this. So we go 7, 8, 9. We line them right up on this one tonight, and the band played on. So, Robert, next week we're going to go to Hong Kong, I think, and talk about the Jackie Chan action classic from the 80s, Police Story, with Shane Scalf of, I don't know if their show is called HAPA Supremacy any longer, but that's what it used to be called, HAPA. But they are, Shane and Nico are the hosts, and they do like a live stream interview show. I was on it a couple of years ago with Pat from Liberty Weekly, and he suggested Police Story. And so that's what we'll do next week. It won't really have a whole lot to do with pandemics. We've been on this tear of Contagion and smallpox and bats and all of these things. Everything's kind of all been related lately. So I'll see how I can tie it in. Oh, you know what? I've heard conspiracy theories that this whole COVID situation was because they needed something to quell the Hong Kong protests.
Diabolical.
And we'll be talking about based in Hong Kong. So
there we go. That's the tie-in.
We're looking at all together. Missed that, John. What's that?
I hope we're all alive to see it.
Yes. Hopefully we all live another week and can do that one when we come back. So thank you guys for joining us. This has been lastnighters.com/116 for the show notes for this one. We'll have a bunch of stuff, books and articles that we mentioned. Also, John's prior appearances where he was on for Reds and The Aviator. And was there something else, or was that the big gap between Aviator and Reds?
Yeah, I think those are the two other films that I was on here for.
Okay, well, we enjoy having you on, and I would cordially invite you back sometime in the near future, assuming we're all still alive.
Assuming we are still alive, I would love to.
Okay, well, thank you for that. So we will suggest that all of you wash your hands, maintain some social distancing, be wary of government, don't necessarily believe everything they tell you, but also be safe. Better safe than sorry. That's what I've been doing on my end. We're basically living as if this could be a very prolonged situation. So we're already like almost rationing our our foods and deciding what to eat first based on how long those things are going to last. If things turn out being fine, then great. We'll go back to the grocery store. We'll go back to Costco in a couple of weeks. If not, a month from now, I'll be happy that I did this now. So basically, the question I would ask myself is, can you afford to be wrong? I think as a prepper or a prep light type person, I can't afford to be wrong. If I wasn't prepared at all, I could not. So that's my PSA at the end of this AIDS talk. This is my TED talk talking about AIDS and the band played on lastnight.com/116. So any final words from you, Robert, on how people can support us over here, up in here?
Well, you can always join us at Actual Anarchy Patreon. You can check us out on YouTube. You can subscribe to YouTube. You can leave a comment on YouTube. You could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can tell your friends and family about the show. You can just engage with us, not get engaged unless you're single. Let me know. But
yes, got engaged. So there you go.
Indeed. Yes. Well done, sir. But yeah, any kind of interaction with us is just, spurs us on to keep producing content. So thank you for all your eyeballs and all your earballs. And hopefully you'll like what we have.
I will second that motion. Motion carries. And good night from last night, everyone.